All right, y'all. This is Wednesday's video. We're going to talk about angles of rotation, reference, and coterminal angles. So those are three different types of angles we're going to talk about. Angles of rotation we talked about a little bit on Monday's video with the unit circle. Remember, with angles of rotation, if it's going upwards from the x-axis, that means it's a positive angle. And that means if it's going down, that means it's a negative angle. So when we draw out the angles, we have to make sure we're going in the right direction when we're going in positive or negative. So like, for example, just drawing out angles of rotation. So if it's 85 degrees, this is our example, it tells us 85 degrees. So that's what it wants us to draw, okay? So whenever we draw that, 85 is pretty simple because we know that this right here is 90 degrees. This axis up here goes straight 90. So that means that my angle is going to be just a little bit close to the 90, but not quite. And I'm not asking you to be perfect about this. It's just a sketch of what the angle would basically look like. And whenever you draw the angle, so we've got that, and you know it's going to start here on your x-axis. So you always have to draw which direction you're going, because technically you could have your arrow going up that way or you go all the way around. So because we're talking about positive 85 degrees, that means it's going to be pointing up towards that angle, okay? So for example, 2 with 145 degrees, with 145 degrees, this is 90, so we know that it's got to be more than this, but then this would be all the way to 180 degrees, remember? So that means it has to be somewhere between 90 and 180, okay? So that means that we're just going to sketch it out. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, so it's going to be somewhere between 90 and 180. And again, we have to draw our arrow. You always have to have the arrow to point which direction it's going. Because again, you could go that way, and that's a negative something or other, okay? So we're going positive 145 degrees. So that means it's going that direction, okay? With number 3, it's talking about negative 210 degrees. So this one's kind of a little bit harder to see. And so what I tend to do, if it's a first of all, negative means that it's going to be going down, okay? So our arrow's going to go down, but we need to know exactly how far around we're going. So we know that if we go down to here, that's negative 90, okay? If we keep going, that's 180. Now, if you add another 90 to 180, calculator, 180 plus 90, that means that this arrow right here goes a negative 270, okay? So that means we don't want it, we want only negative 210. So we don't want to go all the way to another axis. So that means we're going to just go a little bit over 180 to get to that 210, negative 210 degrees. So because it went down and went around, that's negative 210 degrees. And again, it's just a guesstimate. It's not perfect, but it's a little bit above 180, but a little bit below 270, okay? So with number 4, with negative 300. And another way that you can do this is I tend to, if you don't know exactly how far to go, you know each segment is 90 degrees. So if you do this, if you do 300 minus 90, that means I have to go around one time to 1/4. Then I subtract 90 again. That gives me 120. So I still have 120 degrees left to go. If I subtract 90 again, I can go all the way there, and so 30 is what's left over here, okay? So I went 90, 180, 270, and I remember 300 minus 270 is 30 degrees, so I'm just going a little bit past the 270 line for 30 degrees to say that is negative 300 degrees, because we're going 90, 180, 270, and then a little bit over to get to 300. And again, it's negative, so we had to go the opposite direction, okay? So then with 455, now we know a whole circle is 360 degrees, right? So that means we automatically know we're gonna have to go over that whole circle, but let's see by how much. And again, I'm just gonna go about with that 90-degree trick by subtracting by 90 every time. So if I do 455, and I'm ignoring the negative because the negative just tells me to go up or down. So just ignore the negative. So we do 455 minus 90. So that means I can go 1 minus another 90. And then minus 90 again. So that's 3 of them that I'm able to go. And the reason why I know I'm still able to go is because all of these are positive. If it was negative, that means I can't, I'm gone past where I'm supposed to go. I'm going to subtract 90 again. So that gives me 95 degrees. So if I subtract another 90, that means I only have 5 degrees left to go. Okay? Did I go enough? Let's try. 455 minus 90. So that's 1 minus 90. That's 2 minus 90. That's 3 minus 90. That's 4. Minus 90 again means that I can keep going, and that means I have 5 degrees left over. Okay? So that means, so because I subtracted 1, 2, 3, 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it was 5 times because I ran out of space, but 5 times, that means I got to go 5 different increments of 90, and then I have 5 degrees left over. So I'm just going a little bit past this line to be negative 455. So if that helps, just keep subtracting 90 until you're done. So I had to subtract 90 5 times, so that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I had 5 degrees left over, so I still had to go a little bit more. Okay? Because if I had subtracted 90 again, then I would have had a negative, and that doesn't make any sense. And you can't see it on my calculator because it's got junk on it, but that's a negative 85. So that means it wouldn't work. All right, so let's try this next example where it's talking about 790. So 790 is positive, so that just means I'm going to go up. So 790 minus 90, so that's 1 time. Minus 90, that's 2 times. Minus 90, that's 3 times. Minus 90, that's 4 times. Minus 90, 5. Minus 90, 6. Minus 90, 7. Minus 90, 8. And so if you look, that means that there's 70 degrees left, okay? So that means I'm not going to go a full 90 degrees. So I'm going to go up really close to 90 because 70 is close to 90 degrees, but not quite at 90. So, and then I draw my line out to point out that that's where my initial angle is. So we went all the way around till 790 degrees and we stopped there, okay? And some people are going to say, well, why didn't you just subtract by 180 or 360? But 90 is the smallest increment that we know. So if it goes over 180 or over 360, then you're going to have some issues with knowing exactly where to stop. So that's why I start with the 90. Okay? So then on the reference angles, so a reference angle is an acute angle that is between the terminal side of an angle and the x-axis. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking these angles and we want to try and determine what is the reference angle there. We want to know how far away from our x-axis we are. So whenever it asks you what's the reference angle, it wants to know how far away from the x-axis are you. And so like, for example, say your angle is in quadrant 1 here, that means you're going to look for this space right here. If it's in quadrant 2, you're looking for here because this is my x-axis. So remember, that's where we're looking for. And again, if you're in quadrant 3, you're going to want to find this space right here. And if you're in quadrant 4, again, you're trying to find that space. So like, for example, here, we're at 135 degrees. So we want to know this space right in between here. We want to know how big that angle is. Well, we know that that's between, we're at 135. Well, the distance between that is 180. So all I have to do is take 180 minus 135 to give me 45 degrees. Because the whole entire turn would have been at 180, but we only had 135, so we had to subtract from 180 to get the rest. Okay? So then for our next example where we have 210, again, we're here, we need to get close to the x-axis. So we're looking for what this space right here is. Okay? So here we did 180 minus 135 to get 45. Here, we're at 210 degrees. Well, we know that this full rotation is 180. So the space between here and here is the difference between that. So if I do, again, 210 minus 180, so this time I had to switch it up. My angle is subtracted from 180. So if I do that, 210 minus 180 gives me 30 degrees. So that is how far away the space between here and here, because this whole thing is 210, but if I take away the 180, that's what's left over there. Okay, so, and if you notice, if you ever notice, so this is in quadrant 2 here, okay? So if it's in quadrant 2, you can automatically say, okay, I'm going to do 180 minus my angle. Okay, if it's over here in quadrant 3, that means we can do our angle minus 180. Okay, so this angle here is in quadrant 4. So we need to know this space right here because that's what's closest to our x-axis there. Okay, so I need to know this space right here. Well, that's getting closer to a full circle, right? Because this is almost the whole thing. That's 200, or no, 300 degrees. We need to know the rest of the full circle. So that means because a whole circle is 360 degrees, we're going to do 360 minus our angle, which is 300, to give us 60 degrees. So that means this angle right here, our reference angle, is 60 degrees. And that's going to happen every time you're in quadrant 4. So if you're in quadrant 4, just take 360 minus your angle to get the rest. Okay? Now, for example, down here, and here in this one, if it's in quadrant 1, all it is whatever the measure of your angle is. So that's the same thing. It's the measure of your angle. So if it's in quadrant 1, that's easy peasy. It's just whatever your measure of your angle is. If it's in quadrant 2, you'll subtract your angle from 180. If it's in quadrant 3, you do your angle minus 180. And if it's in quadrant 4, do 360 minus your angle. Okay. Now here is a little bit tricky because this one's got a negative angle here, right? So this is negative 210 degrees. Right? No, negative, hold on, my paper is a little fuzzy. Negative, that don't make sense. We're going to change this to negative 100 degrees, okay? So I'm changing that problem just because I can't read it. So we're going to say that it's going negative 100 degrees because this would be negative 90, so that would be negative 100, okay? Now here, we need to know what the rest of it is towards our x-axis. Now if it's negative, we need to find out, okay, what's the rest of the space between negative 100 to negative 180? Well, that would just be negative 80 degrees. Okay, or not negative 80, just your reference angle should always be positive, so that's just 80 degrees there. Okay, so because the space between here and here is 80 degrees. So for this next example, we're at negative 1. Again, my paper, I'm sure your papers are the same way. It's hard to read what that's saying. Negative. Again, I'm going to write it in negative 1, we're going to say 190. Okay, so that's negative 190 degrees. So we, again, need the space here. Okay, now technically because it's negative, that's kind of like reading our quadrants backwards. This would have been our third quadrant. So that means all we have to do is take our angle and subtract 180 because that's 180 there. We just need the space there. And I'm ignoring the negative, so I'm going to do 190 minus 180 to give us 10 degrees because that's the space between here and here. Okay, so if it's negative, you just have to say, okay, this is 180 degrees. I need to know the rest of it, so I'm going to subtract from 180. Here, this was close to 180, so it's kind of like reading your quadrants backwards. So like this, when they're positive, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's negative, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm reading them backwards. So because this was technically like our negative 2 quadrant almost, you would subtract from 180. Okay. And so for this next one is technically, so again, it's negative. So we're going to say that this is negative 340 340. We'll say negative 340 because I can't read what the paper says. That's supposed to be a degree symbol. I can't write. So negative 340 degrees, okay? We need the rest closer to here. So that's 360. So again, just like when it's in quadrant 4, so again, if it's negative, read your quadrants backwards. 1, 2, 3, 4. We would do 360 minus our angle, which is 340, which would give us 20 degrees. So again, you're just trying to find the distance between those two, the space and our x-axis there, okay? So if it's positive, this is our rules, and you can kind of figure it out. You don't have to use those equations specifically. You can just sit there and say, okay, I'm close to 180, so I'm gonna subtract it, and that gives me 45. Here, I'm over 180, so I'm gonna subtract that 180 to give me 30, and so forth, okay? So then on the next page, we're talking about coterminal angles. Coterminal angles is an angle of rotation that can be described infinitely many ways. It can be described by a positive or negative angle of rotation by making multiple full circle rotations through adding (360 degrees). Well, I should say adding / subtracting. 360 degrees, or if we're talking about radians, that would be adding 2 pi or subtracting 2 pi, okay? So what I mean by that is 165 degrees is close to 180, so we're gonna say it's about there, okay? 165 degrees is about right here, so that's 165, okay? So say I want the same angle, but I want a different measurement, okay? So a coterminal angle is basically saying if I add or subtract 360 to this, I'm going to end up having my angle in the exact same place, okay? So say I do 165 plus 360. 165 plus 360 gives me 525 degrees. So that means that if I were to take this angle, and 360, remember, is a whole full circle. So if I go 165 and add that 360, guess what? I'm going to end up right back in the same place. Okay, and if I subtract 360, so 165 minus 360, we're making a full circle again. Oops, I typed it in the calculator wrong. Minus 360 gives me negative 195 degrees. So if I started here and went negative 195, I'd still end up in that same place. So coterminal angle is literally just adding and subtracting 360 to an angle if it's a degree. If it's a radian, you're going to add or subtract 2 pi to both sides. So for example, we have 3 pi over 4, right? So 3 pi over 4 is, remember, we said that on Monday, this is 1 pi and the whole circle is 2 pi. So 3 pi over 4 will be right in the middle between, basically 3/4 of the way between 0 and 1 pi. So that's my 3 pi over 4, right? So if I want to add 2 pi, here's where some of y'all are going to not like this. So we're adding 2 pi. Now, you can't just add across like that because they're not, with fractions, they have to have common denominators when you add. So what we have to do here is, because we're talking about out of 4 on the bottom, this becomes 3 pi over 4 plus, well, 4 times what is 2? Well, that would be 8, because 8 pi over 4, if you would look, you would have simplified that to 2. So whenever you're adding or subtracting 2 pi, you always have to convert 2 pi into a similar fraction to whatever you're adding or subtracting. So then that becomes 8, 9, 10, 11 pi over 4. So that's one of our coterminal angles, okay? And if I subtract 3 pi over 4 minus my 2 pi, or in this case 8 pi over 4, that would become negative 5 pi over 4. So both of these are coterminal angles, and technically you could keep on adding infinitely many times. You could add 2 pi 3, 4, 5, 6 times. That's still an example of a coterminal angle, okay? If you subtracted it, all of those are still examples of coterminal angles, okay? Now, a lot of times in problems, you'll be asked to identify one positive and one negative coterminal angle. So that means we just need to find one that's positive and one that's negative. So like, for example, 45, I'm going to take 45, I'm going to add 360. and that gives me 405 degrees. So that's one coterminal angle, and it's positive, so we're good. That's one of my positive ones. Well, I also need a negative one, okay? So that means I'm going to take 45, and I'm going to subtract 360. Why did I write 365? Minus 360. So 45 minus 360 gives me negative 315 degrees. So that's one angle that's positive, one angle that's negative, so we're good. Okay? So that's one positive angle, one negative angle. So again, let's try with 225. So with 225 degrees, we're going to add 360, and we're also going to subtract 360. So 225 plus 360 gives me 585 degrees. 225 minus 360 gives me negative 135. So that's negative 135 degrees. So both of these, there's one positive, one negative, we're done. Okay? So coterminal angles is literally just adding and subtracting the same thing every time. So with number 3, with negative 86, just because it's negative doesn't change anything. We'll do negative 86 plus 360 and negative 86 minus 360. So negative 86 plus 360 gives me 274 degrees. So that's one coterminal angle. And then negative 86 minus 360 gives me negative 446 degrees. And that's one positive, one negative, and we're done. Okay? So then with 1,030 degrees, we can add 360, and we can also subtract 360. And you'll see something that's about to happen here. So if I do 1,030 plus 360, that gives me 1,390 degrees. So that's a positive angle. Now, if I take 1,030 and subtract 360, that gives me 670 degrees. Now, remember, I need one positive, one negative. So these are two positive ones. Either one of these I would take as an answer, but we still need one negative. So I'm going to subtract 360 again. So I'm going to take 670 and subtract 360. Which gives me 310. Still a positive angle, okay? Now, there's going to be sometimes when a problem will ask you, I need a positive and a negative coterminal angle that's between negative 360 and positive 360. So if it asks you for that, you would give me the 310 because that's less than 360, because these two are not in between 0 and 360, so that means they're not an answer. But that's only if you get a problem like that. So again, we still don't have a negative, so I'm going to take 310 and subtract 360 again. And that's going to give me negative 50 degrees. So when you're writing this out, if it asks for one positive, one negative, any of these three are positive answers. And any of those three are ones that I will take. And the negative one will be your other answer. Okay, and that works the same way with if you're given a really big negative degree. You'll just constantly add 360 until you get to a positive number. Okay, so now we're into problems where we got our radians. We got 2 pi over 3, and we want to find some coterminal angles. Okay, so with 2 pi over 3, now again, just like I said up here, we have to take 2 pi and convert it into something similar with a common denominator as the fraction we're adding to. So with 2 pi over 3, that's just all we're doing is we're going to take our bottom, just like I did here. 4 times 2 gives me 8. So that means that would be 2 pi over 3 plus 6 pi over 3, because 3 times 2 is 6. And if you divide these, you'll see, oh, this is the same thing as 2 pi, because 6 divided by 3 is 2. Okay, so whenever you add with radians, you have to make sure you have a common denominator. And the way you do that is you keep the bottoms the same and then multiply that bottom by 2 to turn it into 2 pi. Okay, so then that becomes 8 pi over 3. So that's one of my coterminal angles. Then we do 2 pi over 3 minus 6 pi over 3, which gives me negative 4 pi over 3. So that's one positive, one negative, and both of those are my answers. okay? Now with question like number 6, where I have 7 pi, there is no denominator, so we're good. All we have to do is add and subtract 2 pi. So 7 pi plus 2 pi gives me 9 pi. 7 pi minus 2 pi, ooh, I don't know why I was writing a 5 there, minus 2 pi gives me 5 pi. Again, just like we're back at like we had at number 4. It's not a negative, so I have to subtract 2 pi again. So 5 pi minus 2 pi gives me 3 pi. Okay, and instead of writing it all out, I'm just going to subtract 2 pi again, which would become 1 pi. And then if I subtract 2 pi again, that would become negative 1 pi, or just negative pi. So that means any of these 4 are positive coterminal angles, and then this is a negative coterminal angle. So I would take any of those as your positive. I just need 1 positive, 1 negative. So technically, these 2 work as my answer. Okay? So then let's look at number 7. We got negative 7 pi over 4. And again, we have to have a common denominator. So we're going to add, our fraction is going to be over 4, and we multiply that number by 2 to give us 8 pi, because 2, that simplifies to 2 pi. So negative 7 pi plus over 4 plus 8 pi over 4 gives you just pi over 4. So that's one of our positive answers. And then we're going to subtract. So negative 7 pi over 4 minus 8 pi over 4 would give me negative 15 pi over 4. So now we have a positive coterminal angle and a negative one, and we're done with that problem. Okay. So then with our last problem with coterminal angles, we have negative 12 pi over 11. So we're going to have negative 12 pi over 11. And again, we need a common denominator. So we're going to add, we're going to have 11 on the bottom, and 11 times 2 is 22. So that becomes 22 pi over 11. Okay, so negative 12 plus 22 gives you 10 pi over 11. So that's our positive answer. And again, we're going to subtract. So negative 12 pi over 11 minus 22 pi over 11 is negative 34 pi over 11. And notice when I'm adding and subtracting these, the bottom always stays the same with your fractions, okay? So that means you don't change the bottom. The only thing you do is combine like terms on the top. So the pi's don't change. The only thing is you add the 12 and the 22 and combine those together, okay? And then on the back, this is an example of what I was talking about, where it says find an angle between 0 and 360 or 2 pi that is coterminal to the angle. So 775 is greater than 360. I need to get an angle that is coterminal to it that is between 0 and 360. So that means if I add, that's going to get me farther away from 360. So I need to subtract 360. So I'm going to subtract 360. Gives me 415 degrees. Well, that's still not below 360, so I need to subtract 360 again. So 415 minus 360 gives me 55 degrees. Now this is a coterminal angle that is between 0 and 360, so that's our answer. Okay. So same thing goes with number 2. With number 2, we got negative 1,297. Well, we need it between 0 and 360. Now, in this case, because it's negative, I need to add 360 every time, so that way it'll get closer and closer. So I'm going to add 360. So negative 1,297 plus 360 gives me negative 937. If I add 360 again, that's going to give me negative 577. Still not between 0 and 360. So negative 577 plus 360 gives me negative 217 degrees. Negative 217 plus 360 gives me 143 degrees. Now that is between 0 and 360, so that is what my answer is there. Okay? So then that means we do the same thing when we're given with fractions. So we want this between 0 and 2 pi in this case. So we got 7 pi over 3. Okay, and if you think about it, if you do 7 divided by 3, that's 2.33. So that's greater than 2 pi. So that means I need to subtract. I need to subtract my 2 pi. And again, because we're subtracting with a fraction, 3 is going to be on the bottom and 6 pi will be on the top. So 7 pi minus 6 pi over 3 gives me 1 pi over 3, or just pi over 3. Either one of those is the same thing. So then you're done, because that's between 0 and 2 pi. Because if I do 1 divided by 3, that's less than 2, so we're good. Okay, so with number 14, I've got negative 15 pi over 2. So it's negative, so we're going to keep adding. So I'm going to add 2 pi. So that becomes 4 pi over 2, because that's 4 divided by 2 is 2. So negative 15 pi plus 4 gives me negative 11 pi over 2. So again, that's not positive yet. We're not between 0 and 2 pi. So negative 11 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2 gives me 11, 10, 9, 8, 7 pi, negative 7 pi over 2. Negative 7 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2 gives me negative 3 pi over 2. So we're still negative, so we're going to add again. So negative 3 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2 gives me pi over 2, because negative 3 plus 4 is positive 1. And that is between 0 and 2 pi, because that's the same thing as pretty much 1/2. Okay? And so you don't have to write all these steps out. If you know that you're going to constantly be adding 4 every time, that's fine. And as long as I get that final answer, you're good on your classwork. Okay? So that's the notes with angles of rotation, reference, and coterminal angles. So with your classwork, make sure you read the directions carefully for what it's asking. So just as a reminder, angle of rotation means you're just sketching what the angle asks you for. Reference angles means I want to know how far away from my x-axis I am. And then coterminal angles means I'm either adding and subtracting 360 or 2 pi to find an angle that is equal to that same one. So here on your classwork, this is asking about to find the reference angle. So we want to find out how far away from our x-axis we are on all of these problems. Okay, some of them are written as pi's. So that means you're going to have to, what you can do is we talked about converting between degrees and radians. So like for example, number 2, we have negative 25 pi over 18. And if you remember, we talked about converting to degrees means that becomes 180 over pi is what we multiply by. Okay? Cross those out. And so negative 25 gives me negative 4,500 over 18. And then divide by 18. And we get that's negative 250 degrees. So what you can do, and you don't have to do this, but what I find easiest is to convert the radians to degrees. So this is negative 250 degrees right here. So you need to find out how far away from my x-axis you are. So that helps you with finding out how far away you are. Okay? On the back side of your classwork, you're doing the same thing, but your angles aren't sketched out for you. So I suggest sketching them out. Okay. Numbers 11 and 12 say state if they are coterminal. So you're just telling me yes or no. Are they coterminal to each other? And of course, you're going to have to add and subtract by 360 to find that out. Numbers 13 through 16 says to find a coterminal angle between 0 and 360. So that's like what we just did on the very last page of our notes. And then numbers 17 through 20 are talking about between 0 and 2 pi. So again, same thing, but we're just talking about radians instead. And then number 21 and 22 says find a positive and negative coterminal angle for each one. So that means I want one positive answer and one negative answer for those problems. Okay? And then on the back page, you're just telling me what's the measure of these angles. So instead of you having to sketch them out, you're knowing. So like, for example, this one. this tells you that this angle is 30 degrees, right? Well, you know that the rest of this, the whole entire thing is 90. So if I do 90 minus 30, that means this angle right here is 60 degrees. So you're just finding out what is actually drawn here. So make sure you look at where the actual arrow is. Okay, so like for example, number 33, this is not 60 degrees because this is where my arrow is. It's pointing that way. And also make sure you're telling me if it's positive or negative. So for example, with number 31, notice that is actually negative 60 degrees because my arrow is pointing down. Okay? On the back side, you're drawing the angle. So you're doing what we did at the very beginning of our notes, where you can subtract from 90 or add 90, and then you'll be good. Okay? So this is your Wednesday classwork. Make sure you get that done and turned in. Again, on Google Classroom, I'm going to have this video posted as one section, and I'm going to have the classwork in another section. I'm going to have this worksheet already posted on there for you to print if you didn't go by the school and get your stuff. Or you can just write out your answers for me and sketch them out on a separate sheet of paper. Take a picture of it and then upload it into the Google Classroom under where the assignment is. Okay? If you have any questions, please feel free to either comment on the video or on my posts, and I will gladly answer. If it helps, please tell me what time as far as the video is. If I'm at like 3 minutes and you have a question, tell me at 3 minutes what did you mean there, so that way I can answer questions as much as I can. You can also message me on Remind, and I'll answer those questions there too. If it's a really good question, I'll probably post it on there. Okay, and yes, I will still give you points if you ask me a good question for your team. All right, so this is the end of Wednesday's video. I miss you guys so much, and I hope that we get to come back to school. Bye.